Of God. In this session we will read about generative linguistics. The title of this article is about the half a century of generative linguistics. What has the paradigm given to social science? This paper aims to join marking the fifth anniversary of generative linguistics by focusing on some principal contributions the field has given to science in general. In the first part of the paper, the author discussed the issue of modern linguistics as it is widely taught in local universities, and examine the importance of the generative school in this notion of modernity. In the second part, the author analyzed the fundamental conception and epistemological framework of this school in the study of language, pinpointing 15 legacies it seems to have already left to human thought as follows: break up with behaviorism, reinstitution of the hypothetical deductive method, elaboration of the mind-body issue, revival of the thesis that the only true reality is that of the human mind, reintroduction and extension of the term cognitive, participation in rapid terminological changes in the social sciences, return to the problem of language universals with a strong focus on the genetic origins of language faculty, extended usage of the term grammar, contribution to the deletion of clear boundaries between the natural and social sciences, especially in psychology, rise to reductionism in formal sciences, return to the once forgotten Gestalt principles of perception, radical breakup between lexical and sentence semantics, neo-Darwinism, rise of neuroscience, impetus to the foundation of new fields, often multidisciplinary ones, reconciliation of cognitive and generative linguistics in the future is anticipated. Okay. Dear student, when you want to summarize this session, just the important matters should be noted. But for your final exam, you should read all of the matter, and the details are important. It has been exactly half a century since Chomsky's pivotal syntactic structures came out, a book that would initiate the revolutionary change in history of linguistics. 50 years of this groundbreaking approach have given linguistics a position that it had never had before, that of a leading discipline among the social sciences. However, the period has also seen decades of conflicts and resolution, linguistics wars and truces, disputes and reconciliation in the numerous schools and sub-schools that have emerged since the late 60s. Whether a scholar supports or refuses the discipline, generative linguistics has changed the world of language study. The goal of this text is to contribute to the 50th anniversary of the field by providing an overview of its position in the notion of modern linguistics as it is taught in local universities. And by listing principal concepts, the author believes generative linguistics has given to the world of the social sciences. Naturally, limited space provides room for no more but a short conceptual revision of this major shift in the Western thought, today still acclaimed and widely regarded as the cognitive revolution. Okay, here just gives you a background about this topic, and when you are summarizing this session, you didn't need to summarize this paragraph because it just gives you an intro and background a background about this matter. Okay, here we will read about modern linguistics. What principle exists in modern linguistics? The present moment finds linguistics in a rather chaotic condition. Both in the world and locally, approaches to the phenomenon of language are numerous, often fiercely opposed to one another, with their proponents sometimes personally at odds. In the short introduction that follows, the author will discuss only the fundamental streams in the 20th century linguistics of the Anglo-American world and mention their influence on the research in the country. The very question, what is modern linguistics, begs serious discussions where consent is minimal. In some places, in our country in particular, it is still somewhat legitimate to treat as modern linguistics the traditional perspective grammar, a discipline prescribing what kind of form or expression is suitable in the given situation, rather than describing forms actually used in the language. Globally, such endeavors are today considered pre-linguistics and are not welcome in contemporary language science, but it seems that even this oldest form of linguistic research still attracts attention of not so few scholars. Whether one should use Russian or Russian, a deliverance or deliverance, sweet or perspire, gonna or going to, are some of the problems that regularly stir vivid discussions among both high person and experts. In anything alive is by definition modern. Historically, there seems to be general consent in our country that modern linguistics started with the de Saussure in the early 20th century. Dear students, this paragraph is not important too, and the matter which you should summarize and you should know about for your final exam start from this paragraph. Before this is just an introduction. It is important, this paragraph is important. Historically, there seems to be general consent in our country that modern linguistics started with the de Saussure in the early 20th century. You should know that. The modern linguistics started with de Saussure in the early 20th century. Maybe I ask you this question for a final exam. You should know that. Although the phenomenon of language had been studied from times immemorial, course in general linguistics, 1960, in perhaps indeed the central book in the modern history of the discipline, which was only then granted the status of the mostly autonomous scientific field. Okay. Ferdinand de Saussure in the early 20th century is considered as the beginner of the modern linguistics by his book, which is Course in General Linguistics, CGL, in 1960s. You should know that about the Saussure, about the age, and about the book. Saussure's thesis of the dual nature of language. Okay, it is the principle of Saussure in that book. This paragraph is very important and you should summarize that. Saussure's thesis of the dual nature of language. Here we will read about the principle of Saussure. Dual nature of language. Double articulation. Language as an abstract system that should be described and not prescribed. And principled interest of linguistics in all languages of the world paved the way to 20th century structuralism. Okay, here in these 3 lines we told you about the Saussure principle And here you can see that Saussure is a structuralist person and paved the way for structuralism. Also, many agree that structuralism and its followers in psychology, behaviorism, were ultimately defeated after Chomsky's criticism of the Skinner's verbal behavior in the 1959, and artistically perhaps more successfully after Berg's or Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange in the 1962 or 1971. Both structuralism and behaviorism are still alive, and endeavors responsible for much of the today's terminology, general linguistic principles, or concepts that all later schools would accept, such as, for instance, the idea of constituent. Or, this paragraph is important and you should know about this matter. Or in clinical psychology, as therapies of choice that are still successfully used for treating neurosis. Structuralism and behaviorism are still widely discussed in Serbian universities, perhaps even today, as central paradigms in the study of language. Here, emphasize on this matter that both behaviorism and structuralism are alive, and they are applied in some universities, which is discussed is by definition modern. For an average American student of linguistics, anything before Chomsky belongs to the pre-modern period. Okay, here consider the principles which exist before the Chomsky as a pre-modern period. Break up with structuralism and return to the Cartesian cognitivism and rationalism. Sketch in syntactic structures in the 1957 and completed for the first time in aspects of the theory of syntax in the 1965, indeed represented a turning point in language research. This book, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax in the 1965, represented a turning point in the language research. It is important. The total focus of the language science on human mind, definition of fully abstract formalized models whose purpose is to achieve the so-called descriptive and explanatory adequacy of the theory. But it seems to the author mainly the use of the classic methods of natural sciences in language research. All this made generative linguistics a revolutionary discipline. Most importantly, Chomsky and his followers managed to secure the status for linguistics that the discipline had never had before, from Grammatica, originally the scale of beautiful writing, over one of 7 scholastic disciplines, to Saussure. Linguistics had often lived on the fringes of social research. With the advent of Chomsky, linguistics not only came much closer to principal human interest, but it also literally became the central discipline that would, for the next half a century, keep together fields such as cognitive science, cognitive psychology, artificial intelligence, philosophy of the mind, to name but a few. Such a new status of linguistics has aroused a lot of interest among researchers, sometimes followed by critical trust in anything coming from the generative school, which persists to the present day. Chomsky himself, now very close to his 18th birthday, still writes, model and approaches are changed and appended within the very generative theory. So today it becomes difficult to define this school as much more than a series of dozens of very diversified theories related by the same fundamental epistemological framework. The conclusion is, however, that if something is alive in modern linguistics, at least in terms of scope of activities and research, and thus modern, this has to be the generative scope. If the average American student considers Chomsky to be the father of the linguistic, the dedicated American linguistic student believes Chomsky belongs to history too. Okay, some person believe that the Chomsky, the American student consider Chomsky as the father of linguistics, but some consider him belong to the history. From the point of view, structuralism is prehistory, and traditional linguistics is not really linguistic but a kind of proto-scientific metaphysics. In the early 70s, a group of Chomsky's students, led by George Lakoff and a number of other talented young linguists, expressed serious disagreement with the views of their mentor, creating a separate school that introduced an interpretation of meaning quite different from the one advocated by Chomsky. From the split into generative and interpretive semantics in the late 60s over semantic interpretation in generative grammar to the metaphor believed by Lakoff and Johnson in 1980s. Generative linguistics was in a very turbulent period that ended in the rift into at least two major schools, the School of Cognitive Linguistics led by Lakoff and still dominant in the West Coast of the USA, and the so-called MIT School dominant in the East Coast. Thus, the Chomskyan view of the language became largely known as either generative or cognitive linguistics, but in the broader sense. In the narrow sense, cognitive linguistics today means the West Coast school, while generative sometimes only formal linguistics pertain to the East Coast. Okay, it is important. Here, I want to repeat it again because it is important and you should know that. From the split into generative and interpretive semantics in the late 60s, our semantic interpretation in generative grammar to metaphors believed by generative linguistics was in a very turbulent period that ended in the rift into at least two major schools. The schools of cognitive linguistics led by Lakoff and still dominant in the West Coast of the USA, and the so-called MIT School dominant in the East Coast. Okay, generative linguistics arise in the time which we had two dominant School of Cognitive Linguistics by Lakoff, which was dominated in the West Coast of the USA, and MIT School, which dominated in the East Coast. Thus, this Chomskyan view of language, the Chomskyan view of language became largely known as either generative or cognitive linguistics. Okay, some persons and scholars consider the Chomskyan view of language as a generative or cognitive linguistic, but in broader sense. But in narrower sense, cognitive linguistic today means the West Coast school, while generative, sometimes only formal linguistics, pertain to the East Coast. You should know that. Finally, more radical proponents of the new generative linguistics consider as modern language science only the developments occurring after Chomsky's late breakup. This time with his own early theory and the schools of his former student. The period began with the government and binding theory in the early 80s, continued in the principles and parameter approach, and finally resulted in the minimalist program. This is very important, and you should know that. Finally, more radical, you should know that here the generative grammar or generative linguistic related to the Chomskyan principle. When we say generative grammar or generative linguistics, we means the Chomsky principles and Chomsky viewpoints. And here we will read about the generative principle and generative common terms. Finally, more radical proponents of new generative linguistics consider as modern language science only the developments occurring after Chomsky's late breakup. This time with his own early theory and the scores of his former students. The period began with all of these terms are belong to generative linguistics, and they come from Chomsky. Government and binding theory, which comes in the early 80s, which continues to the principles and parameter approach in the 1986, and finally resulted in the minimalist program in the 1995. You should know these three ideas, these three terms and principles and their age. Government and binding theory in the early 80s, and after that it continues and turned to the principle and parameters approach in the 1986, and finally resulted in the minimalist program in the 1995. The ultimate, at least in principle, simplification of the theory that was becoming overly complicated in its mutually contradiction revision, insistence on the elegance and the self-sustainability of principles, reminiscent of the well-known postulates in the science such as Occam's razor, and finally the urge to reconcile the apparently contradictory models of the descriptive and explanatory adequacy have become the leading idea of the minimalist program. This endeavor represents the current reality of the language science and also still much disputed, undoubtedly stand at the core of the modern Anglo-American linguistic. Okay, here we have the term of Occam's razor, which is important. I want to explain it because you should know that. Okay, I want to explain the third footnote, which is about the Chomskyan view of language. Here said the term Noam Chomsky himself rejects. I don't like this personalization. That is wrong way to think about things. There is no personalization in rational inquiry. Everybody is working on it. But dear student, about the Occam razor. The principle in science claiming that the simplest solution based on the fewest assumption is probably true, called that way after its originator, English, Franciscan friar and philosopher William of Ockham. Interestingly, both behaviorist and late cognitivist schools, mutually conflicting, embrace Occam's razor as one of their fundamental principles. You should know about the Occam razor. Schools diverging from the mainstream Chomskyan approach, forming alternative paths, but still remaining in the generative realm, are too numerous to even list. Still, in this introduction, the author will mention two which he believed deserve to be taken as alternative, yet promising approaches sometimes taught at English departments of Serbian universities. The European school, in particular, follows in its own footsteps from the largely chaotic condition in the generative phonology of the late 80s. Sometime in the middle of the final decade of the last century, there emerged the so-called Optimality Theory. Okay, at the late of the 80s. The term of Optimality Theory in the 1993, which is from Smolsky, arise. Its self-praise and criticize this school still persists as one of the dominant linguistic theories of the end of the 20th century. And today, there are attempts to use its principle outside the borders of the modern linguistics, including visual and music perception. The research in optimality theory seems to be very much alive today, and thus also modern, especially in the areas in which linguistic borders on hardcore cognitive and computational science. Once Chomsky's students, then his opponents, and ultimately researchers uninterested in his program, founded the School of Cognitive Linguistics in the early 80s, a movement usually scoffed at in the generative world, where its name is particularly disturbing. Most generativists would first ask, what is the meaning of cognitive? The title and its legacy respective this school's main contribution to linguistics lies in the study of meaning of individual concept, a problem largely neglected in all generative streams. In particular, the study of conceptual phenomenon of metaphor remains the most valued and acknowledged contribution that cognitive linguistics has given to the study of language, and more brutally to thought. A former splinter group, it is fully detached from generative linguistics, but remains active and influential, especially in the west of the United States and some part of the Europe, France, Great Britain, and Germany. 50 years after the birth of the movement, many other models are alive too and covered in local universities, whether fully or partially related to Chomsky linguistics, lexicalism, functional theory, word grammar, tagmamic with discourse grammar, systematic grammar, stratification grammar, relational grammar, various eclectic approaches. Acknowledging that each of these has its advantages and drawbacks, the author leaves them for other scholars to discuss. As such, diversity of the language science provides room for numerous research endeavors. One can only conclude that modern linguistics can encompass a big time frame as we would like it to have. It certainly is alive in the present day, and it can start from Panini, Aristotle, Augustine, Galileo, the Grimm brothers, Humboldt, Saussure, Bloomfield, Chomsky, Smolensky. The scholar is free to choose his or her framework, and why options are so numerous can have two possible answers. Pessimistic, that this is so because linguistics has still not solved any of its methodological problems, and optimistic, that this is so because linguistic problems are comprehensive and timeless, and have legitimately attracted the attention of thinkers for centuries. Thus, in the study of language, at least, modern seems to be that which we wish to consider modern. However, one cannot deny the syntactic structures mark the turning point in the language since 50 years ago, and that the school emerging from this little book has been the most influential around the world in the last 20-odd years. Okay, here we can see the Chomsky book syntactic structures was very influential around the world in the last 20-odd years. As such, it has not been given appropriate attention in the local circles, and the purpose of the rest of this text will be to show There are many reasons why this should be rectified. In the remaining part of this paper, the author will shortly discuss the impact that fundamental conception of generative linguistics have had on the other social sciences and even the world view of every man at the turn of century. In other words, I will be interested in finding out what the Chomsky paradigm, coming from a seemingly lesser important discipline, has given to the world of science in general. Mind and cognition, the revolution. Chomsky's review of Skinner's verbal behavior, a text now nearly half a century old, is today considered the beginning of the cognitive revolution. Okay, this is important, that the Chomsky's review of Skinner's verbal behavior, a text now nearly half a century old, is today considered the beginning of the cognitive revolution. This is the first, perhaps crucial contribution generative linguistics, among other disciplines, has given to the social science and more broadly the philosophy of science. Indeed, the cognitive revolution represents a radical breakup with behaviorism. Indeed, the cognitive revolution represented a radical breakup with behaviorism. The stimulus-response routine, with its notorious neglect of the common sense mental entities underlying behavior such as ideas, thought, or emotion. Instead, Chomsky introduced a new Descartesian approach, the idea that there are underlying, probably inborn, mental phenomena governing many human faculties, including knowledge of language. The new cognitively oriented scientists should postulate, firmly elaborate, and perhaps but not necessarily empirically proved the existence of this phenomenon. This paragraph is very important, which here gives us information about the cognitive revolution and about the behaviorism and about the rationalism. Not that behaviorists didn't believe there were things such as ideas, thoughts, and emotion. In contrast to rationalism, which believed that when humans are born, have some ability to learning language. They have the faculties when they are born, and through that software which exists in his or her mind, they can learn language. But in contrast to the rationalism and the Kantian approach, the behaviorists didn't believe there were things such as ideas, thought, and emotion when we are born. They just wished to. Here we will read about the behaviorist viewpoint. Okay, at first they believed that there isn't anything such as ideas, thought, and emotion when we are born, and they just wished to methodologically exclude them until such time in which science advanced so that the brain could be studied fully scientifically. Otherwise, our intuitions of our own mental states would be little more than hardly probable convictions, for which the popular term today is folk psychology. The difference, therefore, isn't that much in the intuition and beliefs of the behaviorists and cognitivists, but rather in their methodological preference. In the era of behaviorism, anything void of methodological rigor and strict empirical, usually inductive confirmation, was not considered fully scientific. With the cognitive shift, it became fully acceptable again to postulate hypotheses of unknown underlying phenomena, test their plausibility in artificial formal system, hence the advance of the formal logic and artificial intelligence. and ultimately, if ever check them empirically on the real human brain, like subjects of the flesh and blood. Therefore, the second major legacy of the 50 years of the generative linguistics has been the reinstitution of the hypothetical deductive method as a legitimate approach in modern social science. The bold terms are important, I should know them. Indeed, without this conceptual shift, none of the disciplines of cognitive science, a leading research field in the world today, would really exist. In linguistics, the shift also meant total dedication to the notion that language exists in the mind only. In linguistics, the shift also meant total dedication to the notion that language exists in the mind only. This was not so new at the time, actually, as Saussurian linguistics also viewed language study mainly as a mind science. Yet, the radical notion was the fact Chomsky openly defined generative linguistics as a branch of cognitive psychology. The radical notion was the fact that Chomsky defined generative linguistics as a branch of cognitive psychology. Chomsky considered the generative linguistics as a subpart of cognitive psychology. This means that in the generative paradigm, one doesn't study language as an objective phenomenon existed in the real world, for instance like text, but rather as a set of mutually dependent entities in the human mind, like brain. This is very important. This is very, very important, that in this time they believe that the language just exists in our mind. As before, Saussure believed that we should, about the language, we should read the mind. And Chomsky considered the generative linguistics as a subpart of cognitive psychology. Why? Because in the generative paradigm, one doesn't study language as an objective phenomena existing in the real world, but as a set of mutually dependent entities in the human mind, like brain. This classifies generative linguistics as a typically mentalistic theory. This is important too. This classifies generative linguistics as a typical mentalistic theory because its subject matter is not objective reality, whose very existence in the methodologically at stake, but apparent reality created in the mind of the individual using his or her native language. You should know this point. The legacy of a half a century of such an approach to mental phenomena has been all present in the world of popular fiction and entertainment. Indeed, the idea that the only ultimate reality is that of human mind has found thousands of iteration and reiteration in decades behind us, with the Matrix trilogy as its recent and perhaps most successful dramatization. It would be fair to say that this entire worldview owes at least a bit to the early success of generative linguistics. Naturally, the theory is also cognitivistic, as it is interested in those mental phenomena pertaining to the language which can be described through models of representation in the mind. The very term cognition once meant a set of only conscious ability mainly related to learning. Today, it comprises a large number of computationally based psychological phenomena, from the precision of simple stimuli to the construction of very complex representation. Okay, you can read these matters here to know more about that terms. For example, here 7, which is about the 7th note. This is the 8, the 7. About that, the generative linguistics is as a branch of cognitive psychology. Also an emerging field at the time, this apparent demotion of the status of linguistics paradoxically launched the discipline into the orbit, providing it for a while the central status in psychology. The view of linguistics as being a discipline of cognitive psychology is often quoted as the position of early Chomsky. Yet this author couldn't find the exact wording in his original book. In the later phases, he considered the linguistic part of the psychology, ultimately biology. His position, irrespective today, one could rather claim that generative linguistics is one of the cognitive sciences functioning in parallel with cognitive psychology and not as its subsidiary branch. Okay, here explain about the brain. In the cognitive sciences, the term is taken in an even broader sense, yet even traditional psychological schools define at least memory, attention, perception, problem solving, and construction of representation as truly cognitive process. The reintroduction and extension of the meaning of the term cognitive would be the first major contribution generative linguistics has given to the world of science. Yet the terminological chaos that would soon emerge somehow diminished in the clarity of the term, and thus also the importance of the first legacy as proposed here. Okay, here this is important. This matter, you should know this term. As it may be, the revolution was followed by a series of evolution. Many schools have emerged in the past 50 years, usually retaining the principal ideas and framework of cognitivism. I think it is enough to this paragraph. I will explain it in the next session. Please look at this video many times and ask your question. It is enough until this paragraph.